looking at a few games from the World Cup of interest. The first game I like to check out is Tomashevsky, who's been playing exceptionally well, and this is his game against Morozevich. So in round 4, it was a 5-minute game, I think, with 3-second increments. So I'm hoping the audio is okay for everyone all going on. Okay, so Tomashevsky playing white against Morozevich. So 5 minutes with 3-second increments. He plays c4, and Morozevich needed a win. So all Evgeny wanted from this game was a draw really to go through. So let's see what happened. Morozevich replied with b6 here after knight c3 bishop b7. So black's trying to exert influence over e4, and sometimes that's accompanied like this. So will black be doing that? After d4 we do see e6, and now avoiding the pin with a3, so taking time out to avoid bishop b4. So trying to stop black having such an influence over the e4 square here. But now maybe a little bit of a surprising move. Black's statement here is he really wants control, an iron grip over e4, and this is a bit radical, this next move. He plays f5, so controlling that e4 square with the bishop and the pawn, discouraging white from playing e4. So should white be concerned here? Well, white continues with knight f3, so not too bothered about black's grip on the e4 square. One problem potentially with this structure here is a later d5 from white. This could not only just open up this diagonal, but it also could fracture black's pawn structure into another island, and potentially make use of the d4 square as well. So something like d5 later. But white's, if white's going to pursue that d5, you've got to be careful of the dark squares as well. So we see for the moment, after knight f6, white just plays g3 here. He doesn't care about the doubled pawns. That would give white a fantastic bishop along the diagonal. Black just plays actually knight e4. But these double pawns are more of a concern to stop these double pawns, and white is prepared to give up his dark squared bishop to avoid this fracture with bishop d2, so offering the dark squared bishop. But that's not taken. We see instead bishop e7. Black really wants to not free white's game with this capture here. So we see now bishop g2, and now both sides castling. So Morozevich has a very aggressive looking setup here, and he continues now with bishop f6. And you might think, well, now his sights are set on trying to put more pressure on d4, so you might think c5 would be coming up. And that is soon after rook c1, we see indeed c5. So very aggressive play from black, from Morozevich, putting his bishops, trying to eye these two key central squares. But now white plays actually d5. As I said before, could be potentially quite useful for white to do this. Black now plays e takes d, and after cd we see d6, and this looks as though this d6 pawn isn't so exploitable at the moment. You'd expect a knight coming to c4 at some point later to try and attack this d6 pawn, but black has also, potential majority of pawns like this could start playing on the queen side. For the moment, white plays h4, and now black, this move looks to be designed against something like this, very aggressive Morozevichian style play, clamping down. So h4 looks as though preventative, but with h6 now black's still interested in g5, and it looks a bit crazy to do this. It's very aggressive use of pawn structure here from black, but he needs a win, and it's a blitz game basically, 5 minutes each with 3-second increment. He needs a win, and so very exciting game here. we see after bishop f4, indeed now this is provoking g5, but black is really committing stuff in doing g5. He's going to potentially create weaknesses, but he does so anyway. One thing that's clear here now, after hg, we have this line of attack potentially against white's king, so a very exciting position structurally. Now bishop e3, okay, and okay, black seems to have done quite well so far. These pieces are a bit of a problem, potentially. He wants to try and get those out, but for the moment queen e7, and now white plays knight takes e4, forcing, well, if queen takes, we have knight takes g5, just eyeing the queen potentially, or even worse than that. So we see f takes e4, and this is a very, very interesting position. Now it looks as though this might be on the passive side to play knight h2 here, although the knight might have potentially the g4 square, but it does mean the b2 pawn, it does look to be on here actually. Bishop takes b2, that's another problem potentially. But no, actually there's another way of playing this position, which is offering an even more impressive pawn sacrifice, which is knight d2, offering the d5 pawn here. And it's changing the nature of the position because it's really putting pressure now on e4 to try and knock out that central pawn. And bishop takes b2 doesn't look too tempting for black to play here. You know, bishop takes b2, maybe just rook c2, bishop moves somewhere, and then knight takes e4. This would be very, very pleasant to knock out that center pawn, for example. So actually, okay, this d5 is offered and it's actually accepted. Morozevich accepts the pawn sacrifice, and we get now immediate frontal pressure on the d file. I've gone against d5 and d6 here. Very dangerous pressure, and here is where it really sparks up in this position. What can black actually do in this position? Okay, I'm going to see how many of you are awake pretty shortly now. If the bishop just dropped back, we can just take on d6 maybe, and that's still harassing the bishop there, and e4 looks a bit more vulnerable as well. But it looks also knight f5 looks dangerous. If bishop c6, you know, maybe even actually just queen d6 is dangerous here. And this taking and then taking on b2, that might be playable black. But I think okay, in this position we see actually neither of those moves. Instead queen e6, and now there's a seemingly very, very nasty move that white plays in this position. So I wonder if you can guess it. So white to play. So how many of you are awake? If I give you 20 seconds here, what would you play with white? So 20 seconds starting from now. Anyone? White to play. Okay. White to play. So, as there's been a suggestion for knight takes d6, I think that can be potentially ruled out. Probably not with queen takes d6. We might have bishop e4. Although even this, you know, rook d8, I'm not sure about that. No, it's not. It wasn't knight takes d6. It was this rather spectacular looking move, bishop h3, just trying to distract the queen to be able to take on d5, and then we would have check, and we'd munch the rook. So the game starts to take a spectacular turn here. Can this really be taken? In fact, now we see an immediate surprise. Remember we talked about this H file here earlier in this game when Morozevich had played G5 and we saw HG, HG. What of this H file? We're going to see something spectacular now. Queen takes H3 is played, seemingly ridiculously provoking white to play Queen takes D5 check and win the rook. And this is really, really exciting now, this position, for a 5-minute game. Morozevich's reply is a silent potential killer. Can you see what black just plays here? Or more importantly, the intention. So black to play here. I'll give you a few seconds just to digest the position, maybe. Okay, black just simply plays King G7. Not much else, but offering the rook. But if that rook's taken, then we'd have Rook H8. Let's have a look at this. Queen takes Rook H8. Threatening mate like this and this. The queen, if it just takes on H2, on E4 for example, we just have Queen H2 mate. So this is no good to take the rook, no good. So, okay, it's King G7, a surprising twist to the game. But what of the D6 pawn? So it's not particularly safe to take the rook here with this imminent Rook H8. So very aggressive, creative play from black. I suspect he might have missed Bishop H3 though, the full consequences, because this is still not entirely pleasant. This knight takes D6 instead. Looks quite dangerous for black now. He has weak pawns. E4 is weak. Also potentially knight F5 is a nuisance. But the point is also it's prophylaxis against Rook H8. If Rook H8, Queen F7 check, and then we can take here. So it stops Rook H8 as well. We see instead black playing now knight D7. And this gives white now the chance for queen takes E4, so the queen can come back now to G2 on Rook H8. So again, just in time, Rook H8, Queen G2, protecting H2 and H1. Just in time there. Okay, Bishop takes B2 is played. So black getting a bit material back. So what's the material situation now? 4 pawns each, but white has pretty dangerous looking threats, like taking a knight F5 with this exposing attack on D7. So Morozevich plays Queen takes G2. After King takes G2, look at this pawn structure that's emerged. 3 to 1 over here, 3 to 1 over here. Can white get the pawns going? An interesting thing now happens after knight. Well, actually, the immediate threat is of knight F5 does seem dangerous. So can actually black take time even to protect G5 here? You know, if King G6, maybe there's a nasty move actually, knight C4 as well, actually just double attacking 2 pieces as well. So this is pretty critical position for black. Morozevich tries knight E5. So he's offering this G5 pawn, and it does look as though, you know, G5 means free connected past pawns potentially. So bishop takes G5, but on the other hand, bishop takes A3, and we've got free connected past pawns here, ready to roll. So a very exciting scenario, fantastically exciting 5-minute game here. There's a slight weakness of the last move. This bishop coming off this diagonal here. A nice skewing diagonal, lots of pieces on the skewer there for summer to eat lots of pieces. We see bishop D2 going for that skewer with bishop C3. That has to be stopped. Bishop B4, again going for the skewer. Bishop C1 now, bishop B2, skewer time. Okay, king comes off the skewer line, bishop B2 anyway. It's a powerful bishop on that diagonal. So it's not about the passed pawns yet. The passed pawns haven't moved for either side. It's about other things like king safety. We see now Rook H5 protecting E5, and now Rook H1. It's really quite dangerous, this position. There's no easy reply like Rook H8 here. I mean, we just play bishop takes E5, leaving H8 hanging like this. So we can't reply very easily here to Rook H1. White's actually winning possession by force of this H file, it seems, in this position. What can Black do? And his E5 will still be loose after. He does take on H1, Rook takes H1, so White possesses that H file. Knight F7, and it looks really incredibly dangerous. This knight and this bishop are covering quite a lot of squares here, but for the moment the D6 knight's challenged, it moves back. If White can just get in F4 and G4 and F5, this looks very, very juicy. This rook's covering this bishop's covering this. This will look all over. These passed pawns have got the king to checkmate as well as an added bonus in this position. So we see A5. It does take a long time for this A pawn to come down. F4, and it doesn't take so long for G4 and F5 check. This diagonal has to be blocked. Surely it's too much to have this bishop on the diagonal. So C4, trying to maybe respond with C3 if needed. Try and maybe get this A pawn going. G4 now. So F5, huge threat of F5. Mating here. This would be mating. Bishop's on there, the rook's on there. G5 is covered. F5 is a threat of mating. Okay, C3 looks as though it might be a useful resource, but it still might be quite dangerous for Black. If C3 plays giving up a pawn, he didn't try this. I mean, maybe just F5 check anyway, drive the king back and then knight takes C3. It just doesn't look very pleasant at all, even that example. So Black played actually knight D6, and he's sacrificially trying to parry F5 check. After F5 check, Morozevich is forced to give up his knight here. This is all pretty backfired. If he moves his king, then I think just Rook H7 check is very powerful. This rook's loose here, so we can just pick up the rook. Or maybe, no, in this position we play knight takes D6 check first, and then just maybe check, mind you, bishop F8. These pawns are still dangerous. This looks grim as well, but okay, Morozevich doesn't, that's not his intention to go into those lines. After F5 check, he just sacrifices the knight with knight takes F5. Okay, knight takes F5, and oh no, I've just managed to mess up the game score. I'll just put the game score back, I think. Let's check my game score. G takes F5. Oh. Pardon me. So after knight takes F5, let's put the game score back. F5 check, knight takes F5. Morozevich is sacrificing his knight. So king takes F5. And now very powerful move, king F3. So the king is controlling some key squares here. Rook C8, Rook H6. Again, another mating net. Now with Rook F6, the king is covering G4 here. Bishop's covering E5. So Black has to stop this mate now with C3. But now we see Bishop takes C3. And there's a nasty deflection tactic here on D6, it seems, to win the rook potentially. Bishop takes C3, knight D6 check. But is it? Because king G5 is attacking the rook. So he can't just take there, he'd be losing. These pawns would come down after taking the rook, because he can't do that. The intention is actually to secure a draw. All he needs is a draw to go through. He plays knight F7 check. And after king F5, something was missed here that he can get more than a draw. Can you spot it? If I give you 20 seconds starting from now. A move that was missed. Severe time pressure. It's just a blitz game. So what would you play here as white? if I gave you 20 seconds starting from now? Anyone? You'd secure a draw. You could secure a draw to go through. All you need is a draw here. That's the game situation. But I think we're just seconds on this clock. You know, white actually has. Look at these squares that are covered by the knight and the rook. Pardon me. The knight's covering all of these squares, and the king is covering quite a few squares. We've actually got a mating net. E4 would have actually been checkmate. It was missed. White just needed a draw though. So knight d6 was his intention, and a draw was agreed after this check and draw. Very, very exciting. So this Evgeny Tomashevsky 2706 has been taking some scalps in this tournament. Fantastic performance by him. So let's have a look. So he knocked Morozevich out with this game. So it went down to the blitz. Okay, so an exciting game, I thought. I hope you did as well. Even though, you know, ended like that. Amazing. So okay, let's have a look now. Just to keep the interest. There's another player that was doing exceptionally well called Anton Korobov. So he has been doing fantastically well in this tournament. And let's go back to the 21st, 6 days ago. It's 27th today. So on the 21st, he was playing the US #1 Hikaru Nakamura. Let's have a look at this game. So d4 from Anton Korobov, and Nakamura plays d5. So no King's Indian defense. He's not messing around. He's trying to play solidly with black for the moment. c4, c6. Botvinnik would be proud. It's respectable to play the Slav. So knight c3, e6. Still, it's respectable. Semi-Slav. Traditional pawn triangle. e3. Blocking in the bishop. What's the idea of this system? Modest. Trying for a small nagging advantage. Knight d7. Note, black hasn't committed the knight here to f6. So what is this up to, this move order? Well, we're about to see. After knight f3, black to play. What would you play with black here if I gave you 20 seconds starting from now? Any Slav experts? What would you play? So you're playing black. Would you really want to do anything else apart from knight f6? This knight to f6 looks fairly standard, doesn't it? Well, okay, Nakamura, he's made this comment recently which struck me in an earlier tournament. I think it was earlier this year. He said, you know, the openings of games make statements. And I think there was this Sicilian Dragon game. He beat some people who was making a statement. You know, when he plays the dragon, for example, you know, he wants to win. I think this is making a statement. This move f5. It's making a statement because it's a Dutch stone wall. Okay, it's a Dutch stone wall, but potentially, you know, it simplifies white's strategic tasks quite significantly because the structure is so fixed. White's strategic task is often just to exchange off these dark squared bishops and then to sort of torture black on dark squares like these two. If this bishop can be eliminated especially, it's simplified white's positional plans a little bit in principle. But will that be white's plan here? You know, this knight has committed to c3, so there's no quick b3 and bishop a3. If the knight's on b1, it's sometimes handy for exchanging this guy off. That's not on the cards. White actually plays bishop d3, and you might think this seems utterly pointless in a way to play bishop d3. What is the bishop actually doing there? It's just biting on f5. Actually, it can be quite useful sometimes. On cd, ed, bishop takes f5 will be on. So this threat of cd is the tension black has to be scared of a little bit with bishop d3. We see actually now Nakamura playing even more oddly though than before. What you might expect is a routine knight f6, but maybe with cd as a threat, he wants to reinforce f5. You know, if knight f6, cd, ed, we might just take that pawn. And we also, perhaps as black, don't like this open invitation here for this b5 square at some point. So we actually see this rather odd looking move, knight h6, just securing f5 actually, tactically. So cd, ed is possible here. It's odd. It's odd to play knight h6, but it makes certain logical sense. Now, in the old days, yeah, g6 was played in some classic Capablanca games. The problem with g6, we're weakening a lot of dark squares. That's often punished later. So knight h6. Okay, it has some logic to it. And we see again queen c2. And you might think, well, what's the point? It's again this f5, you know, cd and this relentless quest for f5 to be exposed as a weakness. Black doesn't really want to play d takes c in a hurry. He'd be losing his central control. e6 will be a target. So instead, you know, we see now a temptation. Should black try and cover up this b5 square, you know, to be able to take with the c pawn, because there's also could be a pain with knight b5s potentially if cd is on the cards. We see now a6. And I don't know. It looks funny, the play of black. You know, putting all these pawns on light squares. It's like drafts, what we call in England, or you know, it's a lot of dark square weaknesses. But is it actually logically justifiable now? Well, what we can do with black is after cd we can play c takes d now without any worry of knight b5. We're still holding up f5 here. So again, you know, some logic. But, and there's a but now, which comes with white's next move. White doesn't have to target f5, but he does actually. I mean, he doesn't routinely castle kingside. It's interesting, in an earlier round in this tournament, Aronian simply just castled kingside against, I think it was Tomashevsky, and Aronian didn't get a very good position out of the opening, got eventually ground down by Tomashevsky in a similar like Dutch defence setup. It was amazing for Aronian to lose that. But here we see white playing quite aggressively. White plays h3 now. Forget castling kingside. He still wants to target f5. And if he waits for that knight to go back, then g4 does really look on the cards. g4, and you can imagine the king over here, and this g-file being fantastic for white later, if the black king wants to castle kingside. So we see queen f6. Black's in no hurry now to try and castle kingside. Queen f6, securing f5 even more, means knight f5, you know, can be played, knight f7 maybe. So bishop e2 is interesting. Bishop e2. Why bishop e2? Has the bishop really done its job here? He's battening down f3, and maybe g4 controlling f3 on fg could be useful in the future. And you might think, well, does the knight want to stay on h6 just to try and discourage g4? Or is there something else going on here? In fact, the knight doesn't bother safeguarding g4 here. Knight f7, just allowing white g4. So there's particular reasons in this position where black didn't bother with that. Which might actually be quite hard to fathom here. Let's just have a quick look at this position. If bishop d6, I think, you know, at minimum white can just continue quietly, I would think, just with bishop, when I say quietly I mean aggressively, with bishop d2 and castle queenside, and keep in reserve g4. So Nakamura is saying, you know, come and get me already. By knight f7, he's waving the red flag to the bull here about g4, because f3 is being secured by this retreat. g4 is actually played here, and now we see why black maybe didn't think it was big deal. And I know this is looking crazy, this next move structurally, but g6. So we've basically got all the pawns on light squares. Virtually, well, in fact, every single black pawn now is on a light square. On the other hand, it's not so easy in this position to exchange off these bishops. So can white really prove he can do something strategically on the dark squares? But there's other things in the position going on here. This g file, this semi-open g file, g takes f5, queen takes, is played. So offering an exchange of queens, that's refused now. e4, and structurally now this guy's going to be a bit of a lemon. Looks a bit of a lemon visually. d takes e4, knight takes e4. Even though we might not grip the finesses of this position at all to any significant level, structurally it looks as though this could be a lemon on the e file, this e6 pawn. Let's see, knight f6, knight takes, queen takes. Now bishop d2. This bishop also is a bit blocked in. The problem with the e5 clamp at the moment is this bishop, but e5 does seem supported by the knight on f7. It's not played for the moment, bishop g7, and white simply castles queenside, and black just castles for the moment. Bishop b4, now rook e8. It looks as though e5 is on the cards, but at this moment now, a horrible moment maybe, white now clamps down on e5. White plays knight e5, believe it or not. What on earth is going on here? What is going on with this move? Let's examine it. What is the nature of this? Is it pawn sacrifice? Knight takes e5. Wasn't played. D takes, queen takes. We have some options here. This bishop is still blocked by that pawn. Maybe just positionally it looks a little suspect here. Maybe something like bishop d6. You see, I'm wondering, bishop c3, there's queen f4 check. Can that really be the intention? Maybe bishop d6. So there's no check, there's a check here, but then f4. This looks at minimum positioning a bit nasty for black, because you know white does seem to have a head start in the attack, and this bishop seems to be blocked in. I'm not entirely. I haven't really engine checked this game. It looks like a dangerous pawn sacrifice. Now in this situation, if anyone wants to suggest anything they think is stronger than bishop d6, then please let me know. I'll give you 20 seconds to have a look at this. This didn't happen in the game. What would you play here with white? I think bishop d6 just intuitively seems quite dangerous, just to get on with an attack, just positionally, because this bishop's going to take time to get out. We've got this ready-made attack on the h and g files. But what would you play here? Is there anything better? Alright, there's no any other suggestions. Alright, let's just carry on. So in the game, what we see is something which looks positionally nasty for the moment. b6, just allowing this horrible knight on e5. But now knight g4 attacking the queen. Queen f5. Now bishop d3, the queen's kicked to h5. And now this horrible clamp now is put on the e5 square with f4, stopping the liberation, it seems, with this horrible bishop. So one problem with all the pawns on the light squares was this light square bishop, funny enough. So bishop b7, can it be liberated on this diagonal now instead? No. c5, block the bishop, torture the bishop. b5. So again, all the pawns are on light squares again, and we've got this backward pawn on this semi-open file. It looks positionally a little bit suspect. Bishop a5 clamps down on a5 and controls d8 as well. We see rook e7. Is black officially grovelling here? Bishop e4 starting to put pressure on c6. Even a battery like queen g2 could be handy for c6. Rook f8. Bishop f3, instead threatening now knight f6 check to win the queen. Is pretty handy as well. Queen f5. Now white here exchanges queens. Queen takes. After e takes, goes for knight e5. I think white's idea, white would love to bring this rook into d6, like after knight e5. D takes will block in this bishop. And look, it will kill, actually. Both black's bishops are just looking terrible here, with the huge rook d6 just to torture c6. This has to be avoided, surely. So we see in this position, rook c8. Looks a little bit grovelly, rook c8. But how does white prove a win here? White does seem to have positional trump cards, but how can he prove a win? He plays rook de1 for the moment. Bishop h6, bishop d2 protecting f4 pawn, knight d8. Now a very nice move, celebrating this bishop is a lot more flexible than this one. We see bishop d1, so the bishop can go to b3 here, nasty diagonal, knight e6, bishop b3 pinning the knight, rook ce8. Now h4, this looks really quite dangerous to play h5 and just peel open this h file. This is a loose piece on h6, and we've got the king to attack on the h file. We see king g7, okay, getting out of this pen at least. And now white commits to bishop takes e6, getting rid of one of black's better pieces. It was attacking these two pawns, that knight, and it was unpinned, so it's eliminated just in time. h5 now, still pursuing this idea, you know, just wrench open the h file. Rook h8. Okay, and now we see king c2, just improving the position slightly. King g8. And now we see rook hg1. Pressure on g6 is unfortunate. It seems quite torture. And look at this rook here. This doesn't look very, very nice. Why, if we just ask for a sec after king c2, why did Nako play king g8? Because it's actually locking in his own bishop. Maybe, you know, he's a bit worried in this position about certain other ideas, you know, like this diagonal. The king's on that diagonal, so it looks awkward. Anyway, let's go through this. King g7, rook hg1, bishop g7. Black wants to somehow generate some counterplay, but he's playing, you know, without a great piece here. This bishop on b7, hg hg, offering the g6 pawn to try and get some counterplay. Let's turn off my iPad for a moment. Okay, so offering g6. So what's happening here? Knight takes g6, and the rook's attacked here. This takes the rook on e1. Rook takes e1, and it looks as though, you know, this is impossible. Not just because of knight takes h8, but even rook h8 check as well. First, so that pawn cannot be taken. If we look at, well, we can just take the exchange. We'll play rook e8. Don't think that's very good. So what we see here is rook h7. So black's just lost the key pawn. It's pretty grim. It's pretty grim stuff. Check, king f7, and now, okay, d4 is slightly loose. And you'd think if the bishop moves, then we might have some counterplay in inverted commas with check. So what does white play in this position? So if you're white, what would you play in this position? You don't want to give black too much counterplay. So if I gave you 20 seconds here, what would you play with white? Anyone? Okay. Actually, there is a question about just taking on f5, which is a valid question. This might offer black the opportunity for bishop c8 and trying to get into an opposite coloured bishop scenario, which might offer some salvation. For example, just imagine this, that the bishop might be good here, coming alive, and opposite coloured bishops. But no, what we see here is a ruthless move instead. The more dynamic move is d5. More dynamic because we're trying to really just queen this pawn now. This knight is an ideal position to dock the pawn on c8 here. More dynamic. Want to liberate this pawn, even if we temporarily liberate the bishop, but overall we want to queen that pawn. So c takes d5, c6, and we're going to queen the pawn, c7, and we are queening the pawn, winning a piece. That's pretty effective. So bishop takes c8, knight takes c8, piece up, thanks very much, rook h6. And now the knight comes back to win more material, knight e7, attacking again these two guys. Rook h2. Is there anything going on here? There might be an idea of bishop takes b2 on this. White just plays b4, not even allowing that, and still forking these two pawns. So here actually Nakamura resigned. It does look like a very unfortunate game, but I think we've got to hand it to Korobov for playing a fantastic game, really. He seemed to improve on Aronian's treatment against the Dutch Stonewall, which I think I might actually have the game score here. That would have been great to have gone over that game. No, I don't. Okay, another time for the Aronian game in that. So let's have a look at another game. So how did Lagrave against Caruana next? Let's have a look at that. And I don't know why, but in this knockout, usually in the Grandmaster All Players, you never really see a Dutch defence. It would all be Groenfield, Slavs, or Queen's Indians usually nowadays. In the last 3 years, I think those are the three most popular with black. But Caruana, after d4, so Lagrave, the French #1, I believe, 2719 against Caruana, the Italian #1, 2796. So Caruana plays f5. This stuff isn't usually seen. So maybe it's the nature of the knockout that black's making this statement. They're going to try and win with black. So an early statement made again for the Dutch defence. But in this game we're not going to see such a rigid formation as the Dutch Stonewall. There are other breeds of the Dutch defence, and we see here this is like almost like could be still like Leningrad Dutch territory. But we see a move here which is not the routine c4. Instead white plays knight c3. And this might be a little bit more effective now against e5. White could potentially, because he's got this knight out, it could potentially I think just take on e5 and do something horrible like this, with the idea of casting queenside quickly with check. So it's a bit discouraging, I think, to e5 here. There might be other reasons as well, but black now does get tempted to play more rigidly with d5. So we again have got this Dutch structure going on, this Dutch Stonewall structure, pawns on light squares, and you might think that if the bishop's bad, these dark squares are going to be bad. What is it going to be in this game now? Knight f3, we see e6. Now white does just routinely castle kingside, bishop e7, bishop f4, and it does point at c7. You might think, isn't it a bit petty that knight b5 is a threat? Can't it be answered by anything like knight a6? Okay, petty you might think, but it is actually played now, knight b5. And the point is that in this position, with black committed to this structure, that it's useful to be able to play c4. The knights unblock the c4 move. So knight e8 protecting c7, and now we see c4. Okay, c6, the knight goes back. So we have here a a position which looks like an iron grip on the dark squares with this bishop on f4, but you might think, well, maybe, you know, it's also a tactical target sometimes to crude stuff like this, having the bishop on f4. So what's the case here? It really depends on the finesses of the position, really. Knight d7, then queen b3. It looks as though this diagonal could be dangerous for the king here at some point. Getting out of the way, king h8, bit of prophylaxis. Rook ad1. Now knight d6. So it looks like a quick entrance. Well, probing white if he wants to exchange on d5 here. He doesn't really want to give up the dark square bishop. Black would love to have the dark square bishop here to cover his dark square weaknesses. We see white playing c takes d5. And now e takes d5. There's no problem with f5 in this particular game. And on cd we might have that b5 square could be useful for white. So this way keeps hold of the b5 square with that c6 pawn. Knight e5, knight f6. So black seems to have a nice grip on e4 at least. Knight d3. But it does look here as though, well, this is a nice eyeing of the dark squares anyway, but also can white consider this sort of plan later? Maybe the knight even coming to f2. You see this knight f2 maneuver sometimes in the king's engine. What we see actually now, we're about to see a strange action with the white queen. Watch the white queen in this game. Knight h5, e3. Still, he's not concerned about any g5s here. We've got the e5 square, and it'll be check as well. So, and he doesn't care about knight takes f4. You know, maybe e takes, and we just use this e file, if nothing else. We've got an iron grip on e5. We see queen e8, rook fe1, knight f6. Now f3, it looks as though e4, there's an interest in e4 at some point. Queen d8, going back, not committing to an attacking plan. So is Korobov out of his comfort zone? If he plays queen h5, does that even do anything? You think this might be in the spirit of some sort of hack attack that you want to play with this formation, but does it actually do anything? Maybe even e4 is potentially playable. Or maybe even just h3 here, just play g4. So anyway, the queen mysteriously went back to d8, and in fact this queen started acting quite strangely now. After rook e2 b6, queen a4 probing c6, that's protected. Knight e5, bishop just drops back here, not minding it's a poisoned pawn. We can just use that pin. But we see rook c1, rook c8. Now the queen drops back to d1. So why are they both dropping back their queens like this? What is going on here? h6. As though g5 might be really tempting here at some point. Knight d3 vacating e5, just in case we've got the e5 square. Bishop f7. And now bishop h3 targeting f5, or is it to do with e4 because we've got a nice pin on c8? It looks as though e4 is becoming a little bit riper than before. Bishop e6. And now queen a4 again. Not only putting some pressure on here, but bishop d7. Okay, this can't be taken, you know, rook a8, so that's not really a problem. Queen c2. White's kind of probing, and it looks as though, is white really just marking out time here against Caruana? I thought it was a bit strange, all these queen moves. But I think one of the strangest queen moves game that I've ever seen at a high level was in one of the Olympiads, Magnus Carlsen playing white against Michael Adams. There were endless queen moves, and in the end Magnus Carlsen played this break in the center and won quite quickly after that. So are this queen dancing by both sides? Is it a prelude to something quite exciting? Queen e8, bishop e5, knight h7. Bishop drops back, as though again is there an interest in e4. Knight g5. Now queen a4. Doesn't even mind c5. It's just now d5 will be really weak if black plays c5. The queen gets out of the way. Maybe even goes back to d1, and we've got a d5 weakness. So that doesn't look as though that's a useful threat. Rook A8, Rook CE1, Knight C4, Bishop F4, and again it looks as though E4 is becoming quite ripe. Knight E6, Queen D1, Bishop F6, B3 kicking the knight. Now Bishop D6, the rook moves, Bishop E5, Queen F7. It's not the sort of game I would normally cover, to be honest, in the shows, but I think it's important to show the game because Rh1 is one of the strongest players in the world here, and this is a critical game for him. So this is on the 25th, just 2 days ago. Very critical game. A lot of manoeuvring here. Has White achieved anything in the last few moves? He's still got an iron grip on the dark squares, and it looks as though his pieces are geared up for E4. Look at these rooks. Everything seems impressively geared up for playing for E4. But it doesn't happen just yet. We see some more manoeuvring. H5, another additional weakness. If the position opens up, you might think the weaknesses like this, which are encouraged, are an additional bonus when the position opens up a bit. Knight E2, Knight B7, and now finally in this position against Rh1, he opens up with E4 potentially a little bit of the position. The rook seems ideally placed against the queen here in any case. It looks as though White's got all this pent up energy now. His pieces are in the right place here. Black's pieces are looking awkward. This looks a bit awkward. This looks like a weakness. Why not? The queen doesn't look right on the F file. Why not? Black now reacts with C5. So huge tension in the center now. Look at all this pawn tension everywhere. So many options. E takes D5 looks entirely logical though, because this bishop, can also be liberated on D5 potentially. Knight takes D4, knight takes, C takes. Now F4, supporting E5, protecting D5. Why not? Bishop E5. White's better after all this now. Bishop D7, Rook Fe2. White seems to be doing great. His pieces are kind of liberated by that E4 advance. So materially, at the moment, White has 3, 4, 5, 6. Black has 3, 4, 5, 6. Equal on material, but qualitatively, White's potentially, well, he's got an exchange option and try and get the rooks in as one idea. This D4 does seem weak potentially as well. It seems a bit dislocated as a pawn goes. So Rook Ge8. White does now take on F6. And you might think this looks quite ugly now, this next move. G takes F6 was played. If Queen takes F6, what's the problem with Queen takes F6? I think Knight E5 is one problem which springs to mind, because Queen takes D4 next. So we're threatening this and we've got Queen takes D4. Doesn't look palatable, so the E5 square needs to be stopped for that knight. So we see G takes F6. Phenomenal move now. This is really powerful, it seems. Phenomenal. So after all that manoeuvring, intense manoeuvring, keeping attention until the right moment, can you guess what move White plays in this position? Very, very dynamic move. And that's the clue. So if I give you 20 seconds here, what does White play now in this position? Ultra dynamic. Liberating pieces left, right and centre. Actually, that's a good clue. If you want to liberate pieces left, right and centre, what would you do here? D6 only liberates the bishop. If you want to talk about dynamism here, D6 just liberates the bishop only. But it's only one piece. What move could you do, and how many pieces could you liberate here instead? And also there's a saying about connected passed pawns. You know, this is just one passed pawn. Isn't it nice to have two connected passed pawns? Super dynamic move. Knight e5. Wow. Knight e5. So we'd see if this was taken, which it wasn't, you know, we're liberating this guy, this Majesty here, for queen h6. We've got the two connected passed pawns threatening e6. We've also got queen takes d4 as an option for e6. It looks huge. This wasn't actually taken. It was, Caruana didn't really fancy his chances here. If anyone thinks this is really good for black, you know, please suggest a move. White's going to get material back surely with interest. And that d4 pawn is a real dislocated pawn here still, about to be taken as well at leisure, if nothing else. So anyway, he didn't go for that. He didn't go for that. He just played queen g7. So can white exploit any weaknesses here? Yes, the d4 pawn is dropping off. Knight takes d7. Queen takes d4. Thanks very much. Extra pawn now. Can black blockade this with knight d6 at some point? King g7, bishop f3. h5 is a bit of a target. Knight c5. d6. Now it looks as though rook e7 is pretty nasty. If there's any knight b3, rook e7 looks nasty. Or they might be stronger, in fact, because actually I think they would have to be stronger there. Let's have a quick look. Knight takes b3 wasn't played. So why wasn't knight takes b3 played? Actually, I think it might. I think maybe just queen b2 and then bishop takes h5, because we want to, you know, that's just one idea. Just one idea. There's probably much better ideas here. In fact, maybe what's wrong with just queen d5? Because then if the knight moves, we've just got rook e7 check. That's even more. That looks even more devastating here. Okay, so that pawn, it can't seem to be taken. It just loses black too much time. So black takes on e2 here. Caruana tries rook takes e2. Rook takes e2. So we're threatened now with rook e7 check again. Rook e8 parrying rook e7. And now bishop takes h5, attacking that. Rook takes e2, bishop takes e2. Okay, and now knight takes b3 is played. Queen d5 attacking the knight. Knight goes to c5. But this pawn wants the queen. We see bishop b5 getting rid of the blockader. Queen f7. So after all this, has white got a winning advantage here? Okay, on pawns he's just one pawn up, but black's pawns are doubled here. He's got this nice running h pawn. And what we see now, look at the bishop and the knight. Something remarkable is about to happen. Queen takes f7, king takes h4, knight b7, d7. The knight is very, very passive here. Passive. Knight d8, bishop c4 check. And we have a dominated knight now. Dominated. If king e7, we, you know, h5, and we're going to queen, you know, it's overloading, so the king sticks around on f8, but we have a dominated knight after bishop d5. Look at this. This knight is entirely dominated. That's a classic dominated knight on d8, and the king's tied down to try and stop this past h pawn. What a fantastic game by white. It looks hopeless. Can black do something with his 2-to-1 pawn majority? a6. King comes up, b5, that's snapped off. King e3. Caruana senses, you know, this pawn's not really going anywhere. The king can just come for it if needed, and we'd still be left with this position where the knights dominate. Is sort of Zugzwang. We're ending in Zugzwang here. Caruana just gives up here with king e7 basically. So h5, the execution with h5, and he has to resign. A masterpiece. It's not the sort of game I'd usually show you. This is a 66 move, brilliant game in its own right though. Knocking out, I believe, Caruana. Lots of toing and throwing manoeuvres, but it just shows, you know, the immense complexity of chess, how you can keep tension going in a game, and you know, how many of us would have tried e4 much quicker than that, sort of all that manoeuvring. But when he played e4, it was a really, really effective break in the center, and then the follow-up was just wonderful, the knight e5 idea. So let's go on to another game. I think I've got one more key game to show. So this mighty Korobov, who went through on one of the games I've just shown you, on beating Nakamura. Okay, he went through to meet Vladimir Kramnik. Shall we have a look at this game, or shall we have a look at it next week? What do you reckon? There's a few of you here. Should we just make this one last game? It's a bit of a grind as well. It's not a quick game, but let's have a look at it. So Vladimir Kramnik playing white against Korobov. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6. Okay, c4, c6. Let's briefly get an idea of it. So knight c3, black takes, Slav. Actually, I'm losing my will to play through the game. Who wants to see it now? Okay, who wants to see it now? Or we could just carry on next week. This is should we get a gist of it? Just a very brief gist of what happened. Okay, let's just get a very brief gist. c5, took on c4. So we have an isolated queen's pawn emerging from the opening. Queen e2. This is all standard stuff. Blockade. Knight cb4, a5. This I found quite interesting. So the rook has stayed here for a5. So a6 is sometimes positionally interesting now for white. Bishop d7, white takes on d5 and plays knight e5. So white's got a small advantage, but how can he possibly exploit that here? Hasn't black got a nice blockade? Queen f3 putting pressure on blockade a bit, and also here we see f6 provoking a weakness, knight d3. And here, okay, it's the c5 square which the isolated queen's pawn is interesting. That knight c5 is supported here. In conjunction with the pawn on a5, this is perhaps more effective than usual, because there's no b6 immediately to kick it without this a file. So this isolated queen's pawn strategy here from white with the a5 and the knight c5 idea is quite interesting, because the knight c5 is going to pick up potentially the dark square bishop, or just be a menace for e6. So bishop f7, trying to solidify e6 in advance. Queen g4. And it looks as though the crude bishop h6 might need to be handled here. So king h8 against bishop h6. Knight c5 though, and it's a pain. This move is a pain now, because the queen and knight are coordinating on e6. There's also b7. So white is succeeding here in getting rid of his isolated queen's pawn, getting also the bishop pair, robbing black of the bishop, the dark square bishop. So this looks a more favourable structure here. Is it enough to win? Queen c7, and we see now a6 just trying to create a passed c pawn now. B takes, b4. So we've got this pawn sacrifice, these potentially dangerous pawns, but that c pawn looks like a really definite positional asset now from Vladimir Kramnik. And I think he's one of the strongest grandmasters when it comes to passed pawns in the middle game. He's amazing with passed pawns in the middle game. So this pawn sacrifice, he's got this c pawn out of it, and he's got the bishop pair. So White's got a small advantage here. Rook fd8, and now he gets his pawn back anyway. h5 seems, yeah, it's attacking the queen but creating some weaknesses. Rook ab8, bishop e1. Okay, and this offers, it seems, b4, which is taken. Now rook takes d8, but now rook takes a7. Materials okay, and we've still got this passed c pawn. It's a bit of a grind. Can he actually win with this passed c pawn and the bishop pair? King g8, the passed pawn is pushed. c6. Are some concrete threats here? Yes, I think even in this position, but the back row might be a bit sensitive. You might want to do something about the king soon. Knight d5, rook b7, rook c8, bishop b5. Okay, which supports the pawn, and also rook d7 seems a bit of a pain potentially. Queen d6, queen e4, queen c5, h3. So okay, the back row isn't such a problem. This bishop might move at some point now. Might even use the a5 square, maybe c7 later at some point. g6, bishop d2, and black doesn't like his position. What is White's plan? Well, black plays something which seems quite desperate now. If White's given time, I think there are some weaknesses to try and exploit, but black plays now seemingly desperate exchange sack. Rook takes c6, just knocking out that passed pawn. Is this enough? Is there compensation for being the exchange down? So bishop takes, queen b1, and it doesn't look as though it's that promising. So was this actually forced? Let's just rewind that. Why did black give up the exchange? Can anyone answer? Let's have a quick look at this before we go on, because it looks as though technically, you know, exchange down in a bad position. So what would White be threatening here if I gave you 20 seconds starting from now? Any ideas? It's a bit tricky. It's quite a complicated position. Covering up the c1 square, I mean, one idea might be queen just coming like this, try and exchange off queens. I don't know, there's some slow ideas. Okay, so for whatever reason black sacrificed the exchange with rook takes c6, so let's go back. Oh, bishop a5 and c7 has been mentioned. Yes, that looks interesting as well. Bishop a5 for c7, that's pretty concrete as a latent plan, but White might want to play queen b1 first against any checks, because something like perpetual checks here. If we go for bishop a5, we might want to secure the back row. It can be done slowly anyway. So for whatever reason black sacrificed the exchange, and this looks bad, the exchange down. So g takes h4, breaks open that diagonal for the bishop. Knight c7, rook a7, knight b5, queen b4, threatening now to mate black on g7, knight d6, check, knight e8, rook e7. Okay, very difficult position for black. The queen's tied down now to e8. He plays e5, king h2, h3. This is just taken, king h7. And okay, he's offering f7 for this bishop, but the bishop just drops back, just leaving this very, very nasty pin on f7. King g8, and Queen B1, which gives the queen access to the G1 square here. This is very, very nasty. The bishop can sometimes slip back to H6. Queen D6, check. King F8. Rook goes to A7 here. Okay, Knight C7. Now torture, Queen C1. Knight goes to E6 now. Check. King G7. And now we go from one pin to another. Queen E8 celebrating this pin. The knight tries to fend off the pressure on that pin, but only to go into another pin with Queen B8 now. And this is just winning material. What can black do in this position? He can only play one harmless check. He actually resigned here. If he throws in this check, maybe just King G2. And there's nothing. This pin is pretty nasty. If Knight B5, we just take the knight. We don't. I think we just take this knight. If Knight E8, we just play Queen takes E8. Okay. So that was. I mean, that was the final move. Queen B8. So again, it was like a positional masterpiece. What happened in this game was a very interesting isolated queen's pawn strategy. We saw this pawn mysteriously coming to A5, but then when the knight came to C5, white started to pick up positional trump cards. He got the dark square bishop, he got the two bishops, and he got that very dangerous C pawn, which later won the exchange. So these games are really quite amazing when you look at them and the ideas. Okay, I hope you got something from this week. I'll put it on YouTube, so comments, questions on YouTube, and see you next week then. Thanks very much. Okay, until next week.